They kicked his wife out with newborn twin babies until her secret billionaire father shows up. He had thrown his wife out of the house along with their newborn twin babies in the thick, bitter cold of a midnight rainstorm. Left her there with no shelter, still bleeding from the cesarean incision, her body frail and trembling as she clutched those two tiny infants to her chest, babies who hadn't even had their first meal. Behind her he stood framed in the doorway of their mansion beside his lover, a cruel grin twisting his face. They watched Evelyn stumble into the heavy curtain of rain as if she were nothing more than trash he had finally succeeded in discarding. Her steps dragged along the slick pavement, cold rain soaking her hair, seeping into the raw, unhealed wound at her belly, every movement a tearing pain through the muscles not yet mended. The babies in her arms wailed, their cries rising and falling with the wind that screamed across the silent streets of Savannah. No calls came, no door opened. The streetlights flickered like ghosts in her blurred vision, each footstep stretching endlessly forward. At last she collapsed at an abandoned bus stop nestled beneath the thick limbs of a tree. Cold, wet, starving, and drained of all strength, she drew her children tightly against her chest, trying to hold on to the last warmth she had left. There was nothing in her hands but a dying phone. And then it lit up. A message appeared. It came from the number once saved under her father's name, the man who had died 3 years ago from a sudden stroke. The message was only 4 words. He prepared for this. Evelyn stared at the screen, stunned, her hands trembling. Tears mingled with the rain, and she couldn't tell one from the other. She didn't understand. But there was one thing Trevor Langford, her cruel and wretched husband, would never know, not even for a second suspect. Everything he thought was his, the mansion where he now stood with another woman, the company he boasted of building with his own hands, the bank accounts with his name etched proudly across the statements, none of it truly belonged to him. In 3 weeks' time, Evelyn Morgan would return. She would walk through that same gate no longer as a betrayed wife, but as the rightful owner of everything Trevor believed he controlled. And the way she would return would bring down everything he had built his world upon: his belief in power, in dominance, in ownership. But on that night, Evelyn knew none of this. All she knew was that she had been cast aside, and she was alone with 2 tiny lives no one but her could protect. Every breath was a battle, every passing minute a fresh wave of pain. And yet it was in that moment of bottomless despair, with tears falling onto the pale glow of her phone screen, that a new path quietly unfolded. A path that had been laid long ago, before she ever stepped into this marriage, by a father who never stopped thinking of the storms his daughter might one day have to survive. Not because he didn't believe in her, but because he knew men like Trevor all too well. Men who wore decency like a costume, but saw women as possessions, and Evelyn, shivering in the cold rain, would never again be anyone's possession. She just didn't know yet that the storm she endured that night, for all its cruelty and humiliation, was in truth the beginning of a return that would bring Trevor's entire world crashing down. Before we continue with the next chapter of Evelyn's story, if you've found yourself moved or drawn into her journey, take a moment to subscribe and click like. It helps us share more stories that touch the heart just like this one every single day. Where are you listening from? Leave the name of your city or country in the comments below, so we can see just how far this story has traveled across the map of the world. We're truly honored to have you with us for each new video here at Emotional Echoes, where emotions are spoken aloud and life's lessons become guiding lights. And now let's return to the next part of the story. The rain that night kept pouring as if it meant to drown the entire city, while the memory of being cast out of her own home pounded again and again through Evelyn's mind, not only as searing physical pain, but as a humiliation so raw that each recollection tightened her breath. Before she collapsed beneath the shelter of the abandoned bus stop, everything had begun right there on the cold, wet steps of the Langford mansion. Standing with her newborn twins in her arms, she saw Trevor look at her with a strangeness so complete, she wondered if this was still the man who had once vowed to care for her for the rest of his life. He crossed his arms, blocking the brightly lit doorway, and behind him, Maya appeared, wrapped in the silk robe Evelyn recognized at once, the very gift she had received during their first Christmas together. Evelyn steadied her breath, her voice trembling as she pleaded. "Trevor, please. The babies are too small. I've just come out of surgery. I need to stay. Just one night." Trevor tilted his head, his lip curling with disgust. Did you not hear me? I told you to get out. You only drag me down. You cannot keep the house in order. You embarrass me in front of everyone. I have endured enough. Each word cut into her skin like a blade. Evelyn held her children tighter, her legs shaking. Maya stepped forward, her voice sweet in a way that carried a sting like honey steeped in poison. Evelyn, you should understand that a man needs someone who can stand beside him, not someone who only cries and demands. If you wanted to stay, you should have made yourself useful from the very beginning. Evelyn shook her head, her eyes burning. I just gave birth to his children. I'm still bleeding. How can he say such things? Maya laughed. That is exactly the problem. You think those babies are some kind of gift for Trevor. They are a burden in every sense. Trevor snorted in agreement. I do not want to see this for another second. You have shamed me enough. I will not let my life be dragged down any further by you or those children. Go. Evelyn froze. She could not believe what she had heard. She tried to step onto the threshold, but Trevor pulled the door shut in her face, forcing her backward. She cried out his name, begging, Trevor, please. I have nowhere to go. I have no family. You know that. Trevor looked her straight in the eyes and spoke the words that later became the deepest wound of all. I have no responsibility for you anymore. You are nothing to me. Nothing more and nothing less. The door slammed. The lock clicked through the rain like the hammer of a judge sealing the death of their 6-year marriage. Evelyn stood motionless for several seconds. The babies in her arms began to cry. She wanted to knock, to call for help. But inside, Maya's laughter rang out sharp and cold, slicing through the rain like needles. Look at her, Trevor. She cannot even fight back, completely useless. Trevor said nothing, and that silence was a cruelty all its own. Evelyn turned away. No coat, no money, no help of any kind. Every step down the stone path was slick and agonizing. That was the moment she understood that in the eyes of Trevor and Maya, she truly was nothing but trash. Trash they had finally cleared from their perfect lives. And in that same moment, the moment she sank to the very bottom of her despair, the first spark was lit, the spark of the storm that would one day sweep both of them from the heights they believed they would occupy forever. Evelyn did not yet know that one more message would shift the balance of power for good. Evelyn sat motionless on the cold stone bench of the bus stop, her entire body soaked through arms wrapped tightly around the 2 trembling infants in her lap. The pain from her surgical wound throbbed in steady waves, but she no longer had the strength to groan or cry out. Her eyes were vacant, staring out toward the empty street where no car passed, only the dim yellow glow of streetlights flickering through the dense curtain of rain. Each gust of wind through the trees seemed to echo Trevor's cruel insults, Maya's sharp laughter like shards of glass embedded in her memory. She had no more tears left to cry and no one left to call. Her family was gone save for her father, and he had died 3 years ago from a sudden morning stroke that took him without warning. That grief had nearly destroyed her because he was the only person in her life who had truly understood her, loved her without conditions. Since his death, she had felt as though she were drifting through a cold ocean with no shore in sight. But in the very heart of that darkness, just when the world seemed completely closed to her, the phone in her soaked coat pocket suddenly vibrated. Evelyn pulled it out and her heart nearly stopped when she saw the name glowing on the screen. Dad. Her hands began to tremble violently, her throat tightened, and she blinked several times, convinced it had to be a hallucination. But no. It was the number her father had once used. For 3 years there had been nothing, no message, no call, and now a single message, no greeting, no punctuation, just one line. He knew this would happen. Evelyn read it again and again, her heart pounding, as if a new pulse of life had burst into her chest. She tapped the message open. An attachment appeared. A short video. She held the phone close, shielding it from the rain with the edge of her coat. And there he was. Her father's face lit up on the screen, calm as always, his silver hair neatly combed, his eyes gentle and knowing. Evelyn, if you're watching this, it means Trevor has shown his true face. I always suspected him even before you married, but I couldn't stop you from loving someone. So instead, I prepared. Step by step, layer by layer, everything you need to rise again has already been put in place. Listen carefully. Do not let him know what you know. Stay silent. Wait for the moment. When the time is right, his entire world will fall apart, and you will not need to raise your voice to make it happen. Evelyn sat frozen. The wind howled, the rain kept falling, the babies whimpered softly in her arms. But the only thing she felt now was a familiar warmth pressing gently against her frozen heart. Her father had not abandoned her. His death had not been an empty departure. He had left her a way out, a road to walk, a plan set in motion. And though Evelyn did not yet know the details or the full extent of what lay ahead for the first time in that endless night, she did not feel alone. She still had him, and now she had a reason to rise. The wind still swept through the desolate bus stop, cold and relentless, but inside Evelyn something warm had begun to stir. Her father's short video still played on the damp screen of her phone, but the image of his face, calm and steady as ever, had already sent her world reeling. In the deep, deliberate cadence of his voice, memories came flooding back. Words he had once spoken, warnings she had dismissed, blinded by the kind of love that does not see until it is too late. She had met Trevor when she was 28 during a startup seminar in Atlanta. Back then, he had nothing but promises, a confident gaze, and a talent for manipulating people wrapped in charm. Evelyn, armed with a degree in education and a fierce belief in the power of love to change people, had been captivated from the first look. He painted vivid pictures of a brilliant future, of a shared life filled with joy, of raising bright children together and building a peaceful home side by side. He spoke with such conviction that Evelyn had often wondered if she was living inside a romance film. At that time, her father, Daniel Morgan, was still alive. A quiet man with years of experience in finance, he had always been an astute observer of people, though rarely interfered in his daughter's choices. But the first time he met Trevor at a family dinner, he had remained silent throughout the evening, and when Trevor left, he said something Evelyn would never forget. "That man knows too well how to be loved, but those who are masters at winning affection often fail to keep it." Evelyn had pushed back hard. She believed her father was being overly suspicious, judging Trevor through the lens of cynicism rather than truth. She had stopped speaking to him for days, cut off their usual daily chats in protest. Her father did not argue. He simply stepped back, watching quietly. After she married Trevor, the signs began to appear. She saw them, but excused them away. When he checked her phone, she told herself it was because he cared. When he began deciding for her from her friends to her career, she convinced herself it was love. She had once loved Trevor with everything. She had loved him enough to abandon her career, walk away from the classroom she had cherished, to become the wife behind the man building an empire. Every time something went wrong, Trevor blamed her. She wasn't strong enough, wasn't ambitious enough, didn't understand the pressures he carried. When she once offered advice on an investment he had taken, the proposal she'd stayed up 3 nights preparing and thrown it into the trash. Sneering that teachers should stick to schoolwork and leave the real decisions to adults. She remembered the first time he screamed in her face when she forgot to schedule a meeting. He didn't hit her, but his eyes made her feel so small, so utterly worthless. Then came the apology, the embrace, the excuse of stress, and she forgave him. She always forgave him. She forgave the late nights, the unfamiliar perfume lingering on his shirt, the strange messages that lit up his phone colleagues. He said nothing more. Each time she doubted, he made her feel like the villain, the ungrateful wife who didn't trust her husband. And then her father died. It was a blow so profound it felt like the last person who truly saw the truth had vanished. But now, in the midst of this rain-soaked night, watching him appear once more through the dim light of her phone, Evelyn understood. He hadn't left her. He had stepped aside to prepare for this very moment. He had known even then that Trevor's mask would one day fall, and now Evelyn could finally see it all. She had once been a woman manipulated, shaped, and silenced by sweet lies and hollow affection, but she was not that woman anymore. Not after tonight, not after her father reached back from the grave to pull her out of the dark. This time she would listen to him, and this time she would not forgive. The dim glow of the phone screen still flickered in Evelyn's trembling palm. The video had not yet ended. After those first quiet words from her father, there was a pause, a breath held in silence. Then he looked directly into the lens as if gazing straight into his daughter's eyes. That look held no blame. It held only a fierce, unwavering trust tinged with the kind of worry a father hides for years until the moment his child needs it most. Evelyn, I know you may not believe this as you watch, but everything I'm about to tell you is the truth. Long before you married Trevor, I discovered things about him that you couldn't see. But I knew the more I tried to stop you, the more you would fall deeper in, so I didn't forbid you. I prepared instead. I was once a senior internal auditor for major financial corporations. That work taught me one thing: Greedy men always leave a trail. I started gathering information on Trevor from his earliest shady deals to the investments he claimed as his own, which were in truth funded with money that belonged to others. Over the past 5 years, I quietly opened a trust fund in your name, called the Morgan Trust. You are its sole beneficiary. Everything I ever saved, cash, property, stocks, intellectual rights, it's all there and it all belongs to you. But that wasn't enough. I knew Trevor would find ways to control you, so I created a shadow financial system that ran parallel to his business. The company he boasts about, the empire he claims to have built with his own hands, is largely funded by conditional loans from Morgan Trust. The condition was this: if Trevor ever betrayed his marriage or acted in a way that endangered you or the children, full ownership and controlling shares would be transferred to the sole beneficiary, you. Evelyn held her breath. She could barely comprehend what she was hearing. Trevor, who had strutted through glass halls and marble offices like a king, who had paraded her through boardrooms and introduced her as a silent partner while basking in applause. He was never the owner. It had all been a facade. Her father continued, "You can't believe he'd betray you. I always believed he would. So I prepared by working with a lawyer I trust with my life. Her name is Harriet McAllister. She's a strong woman, someone who understands the law and understands people. If you are watching this, it means Trevor has crossed the line. Contact Harriet. The password to unlock your documents is your mother's birth date. In the storage file attached, you'll find every document, contract, recording, and even a detailed financial journal. Every piece of evidence has been stored in a way Trevor can never reach. Do not get angry. Do not panic. Be calm. Be silent. Be precise. That is the only way to take back what is rightfully yours and to protect your children." The video ended. Evelyn remained frozen in place, her babies now asleep in her arms, their skin still cold to the touch. But inside her, the despair had vanished. In its place rose something deeper, something fiercer than pain. She didn't know who Harriet McAllister was. She didn't yet understand all the legal frameworks or the mechanisms that would transfer power. But she knew this with a certainty that steadied her breath. She had not been abandoned. She had been protected. With every ounce of love and foresight a father could summon. Evelyn Morgan was no longer the woman left on the pavement in the rain. She was the one now holding the key to overturn it all. And she would. Not for revenge, not even for justice, but for the 2 small lives asleep against her chest. From this moment forward, Evelyn would not simply survive. She would win. The next morning, the sky remained overcast, the clouds heavy and low after a night-long storm that had drenched the city to its bones. Evelyn wrapped her twins in an old blanket, one given to her by a stranger who had spotted her curled up at a bus stop near a small shopping center on the southern edge of Savannah. She had rented a cheap room nearby where the hot water barely reached warm enough to wash the dried blood still clinging around her surgical wound. While the babies slept in a makeshift cradle of folded towels, Evelyn reopened her old phone and followed the trail her father had left behind. There it was, the name Harriet McAllister, tucked into her contacts unnoticed until now. Without hesitation, she tapped the call. A woman answered, her voice firm, clear, and composed, the kind of voice that had weathered time and didn't rattle easily. When Evelyn said her name, there was a pause, just a beat too long before the woman replied, as if she had been expecting this moment for a long time. "I assume Daniel sent you the video. Meet me at 11 this morning. My office is on the 4th floor of the Kingsley building, right in the city center. Bring nothing. I have everything." Evelyn arrived with dark circles under her eyes and a heart suspended between fragile hope and gnawing fear. The office of Harriet McAllister was tidy, classic, lined with wooden walls and lit by soft amber light. Harriet did not smile when she shook Evelyn's hand, but her eyes held a quiet understanding Evelyn hadn't felt from another soul since her father passed. From a steel filing cabinet, Harriet pulled out a thick folder and laid it on the desk before pushing it gently across the table. "This is everything your father prepared over the past 3 years." Evelyn opened the folder, her eyes widening as her fingers began to tremble. Inside were legal copies of the Morgan Trust listing her as the sole beneficiary. Every investment that had funded Langford Consulting had come not from outside venture capital, as Trevor had always claimed, but through carefully structured financial channels controlled entirely by her father. Trevor had never actually owned the company. He had merely operated it, a temporary figurehead, a puppet built up to believe he was king. But under the terms of a confidential contract between her father and Harriet, if Evelyn were ever betrayed or harmed in any serious way by Trevor, All management rights and company shares would immediately transfer to her. No lawsuits, no hearings, no permission required. Beyond the company, the Langford mansion was also part of the Morgan Trust, legally titled in her father's name and designated as a conditional use asset. Trevor had only been allowed to reside there as long as the marriage remained intact and Evelyn had not been abused or forced to leave against her will. Harriet tapped a finger against the document. "You were forced out, weren't you? Any witnesses?" Evelyn nodded faintly. "There's a camera at the front door. I don't know if he's deleted the footage yet, but the neighbor next door opened her window. I remember clearly she saw me." Harriet made a note. "Good. We'll need confirmation. But in simple terms, the mansion by the terms of this trust and its funding clauses now belongs entirely to you. Trevor has nothing." Evelyn could hardly believe what she was hearing. She stared at the pages, at the notarized seals, at the detailed records of fund transfers and dates that lined the documents with surgical precision. She had spent years inside a marriage where the man never missed a chance to remind her that she contributed nothing, that without him, she would have had nothing. But the truth was the opposite. Everything he had came not from his brilliance or his sacrifice, but from the trust and belief her father had placed in her. Not Trevor, not anyone else. Harriet studied her for a moment. Her voice softened just slightly. "Evelyn, it is only the beginning. If you want to reclaim what is rightfully yours, you need to remain silent. Don't get angry. Don't confront him. Don't let him know you know. When the moment comes, we'll let him destroy himself. But you must be ready." Evelyn closed her hand slowly into a fist. What filled her now was no longer trembling or fear. It was something quieter, clearer, and far sharper. This was a battle she would not step away from. She would reclaim everything. Through the law, through truth, and through the woman her father had loved, raised, and trusted with everything he had ever built. Evelyn stepped out of Harriet's office just as the afternoon light began to fade, the sky cloaked in that quiet hush that follows a storm. In her hands, she carried copies of legal documents, formal declarations of ownership drawn from the Morgan Trust, and a hard drive filled with confidential materials her father had painstakingly collected over the years. But more than anything, she walked away with something far more powerful, a plan. A plan that would not begin with shouting or fury, but with silence. It was Harriet who had said those words firmly when Evelyn had still been sitting with her fists clenched tightly in her lap, barely holding back the urge to march home and tear everything down in front of Trevor. "Don't act. Let him walk into the trap himself." Harriet had spoken each word slowly, like a rule of survival. "Evelyn, he thinks you're discarded. You're the failure, the pitiful woman clinging to 2 newborns in the rain. Don't ruin that illusion. Let him keep believing it. The more he believes you're gone, the freer he'll feel. And it's in that freedom that he'll reveal what he usually hides." Evelyn had sat still for a long moment, then slowly nodded. She understood. In their marriage, Trevor had mastered control. He had grown used to being trusted, praised, forgiven. If she returned too soon, he would become careful. But if she disappeared completely, he would expose himself. And so the steps were laid. Evelyn temporarily moved into a small apartment under Harriet's name to avoid being tracked. She changed her phone number, created new accounts, and kept contact with only 3 members of Harriet's legal team. Every transaction, every document was processed under the legal entity of Morgan Trust. Meanwhile, Harriet hired a private investigator to monitor Trevor's movements, record his behavior, his conversations, especially anything involving money, the children, or company ownership. Evelyn was trained to install secure recording software. Every conversation with Trevor, should it happen, would be archived and encrypted. But she didn't call him. She didn't reach out. She vanished. And just as Harriet predicted, Trevor became bolder. 3 days after Evelyn left the mansion, he threw a small party in the house. A surveillance video captured by the investigator showed Maya draped in one of Evelyn's silk robes, holding a glass of red wine as she stepped onto the balcony where Evelyn used to hum lullabies to her babies at night. Trevor stood beside her, laughing, an arm slung over her shoulders, telling friends that he had finally set himself free. Evelyn watched from the screen in silence. She didn't cry anymore. What spread through her now was cold and exacting, a chill that settled at the tips of her fingers. He was writing his own indictment. In his words, in his actions, in every falsified signature and misplaced receipt, everything was being documented. Carefully, quietly, completely. Trevor still believed Evelyn had vanished. But he didn't know that she was watching. Not with the shattered heart of a betrayed wife, but with the calm gaze of a woman holding the deeds, the documents, and the undeniable truth behind everything he thought belonged to him. And one day soon she would return. But not to plead, not to beg. She would return to reclaim it all, silently, and by the law. Evelyn withdrew completely from the life she had once known. No address, no social media, not a single trace left for anyone who had ever known who she was. She deleted every personal account, erased all old photos, blocked contact from mutual acquaintances and former friends, tied to Trevor, severed every thread that might make him suspicious. To the world, Evelyn Morgan had vanished. And just as Harriet predicted, her disappearance didn't worry Trevor. In fact, it brought him an odd kind of relief. Only days later, he began posting again. His public profile filled quickly with new images, his face glowing at lavish parties, smiling beside Maya, a cocktail in one hand and captions dripping with vague proclamations of liberation. A new chapter. Freedom is the most precious thing. Thank you to those who stood by me in my hardest time. Not a single mention of Evelyn, not one word about the 2 newborn children, no sign of regret, only spotlights, champagne, and laughter. He even uploaded a short video of Maya singing karaoke in the living room of the mansion. The same room where just 2 weeks before, Evelyn had rocked her babies to sleep in the middle of the night, dark circles carved under her eyes from exhaustion. Below the posts, hundreds of comments from colleagues, business associates, and so-called friends flooded in. Everyone congratulated him. Everyone cheered him on. So good to see you back to yourself. You look lighter, happier, finally free from that weight. Maya made no effort to hide anything either. On her own page, there were photos of them wrapped in each other's arms on the balcony, kissing in the garden, sipping wine by the fire. Evelyn watched it all unfold in silence. From behind a private anonymous account known only to Harriet, she observed without a word. No comments, no reactions, only screenshots, logs, a growing archive. Every post was cataloged. Every public statement, every timestamp, every indication that Trevor was using jointly held assets for personal indulgence, each one was recorded and processed by Harriet's legal team. Trevor, meanwhile, floated inside his illusion. He believed he had won, that Evelyn had accepted defeat, that everything in his hands, now the mansion glowing through the night, the new car parked in the driveway. The cash that funded his excess was the rightful reward of a man who had finally broken free. But what he didn't know was that his arrogance was igniting the fuse of his own downfall. And the woman he believed gone forever was preparing for a return no one would see coming. Quietly, legally, and with real power. 3 weeks after Evelyn disappeared without a trace, Trevor received a message from an unknown number, just one line. "We need to talk. One dinner, no arguments, no tears." He stared at the screen, suspicion flickering at first, then slowly his lips curled into a smirk. He thought Evelyn had finally come to her senses. Maybe she realized she couldn't make it on her own. Maybe she missed him. Maybe she simply didn't have what it took to raise 2 children alone. Whatever the reason, he felt satisfied, triumphant. Trevor replied with an invitation suggesting they meet at the mansion. He kept the tone light, gracious, even adding a line he believed sounded generous. "You can come anytime. This house will always be your home." Evelyn read that message from Harriet's office. She didn't respond right away. They had been preparing for this moment for weeks. Harriet gave a single nod, her eyes steady and unblinking. "This is when we start gathering the real evidence." Evelyn returned to the Langford mansion on a Friday night, exactly 3 weeks after she had been thrown out of it, with her newborn children in her arms. She wore a simple dress, her face gently made up, her expression unreadable, but her eyes were cold enough that Trevor, seeing her at the doorway, paused for a few seconds too long. She did not look like the woman who had stood crying in the rain. She looked composed, grounded, unshakable. Trevor quickly recovered his posture. He smiled, pulled out a chair, poured a glass of wine, asked her how she had been as if nothing had ever happened. "You're just as beautiful as the day I met you." Evelyn returned a faint smile. She didn't answer. The conversation moved slowly. Trevor spoke first about stress, about loneliness, about being misunderstood. He said Maya was just a temporary comfort, that he had made mistakes, that he missed the children, that he wanted his family back, that he never stopped thinking about her, about them. Evelyn nodded occasionally, offering brief, quiet questions. She didn't challenge him. She didn't accuse. She let him talk, word by word, sentence by sentence. Everything was being recorded. In the living room, tucked between a row of books and a framed painting, was a hidden camera installed by Harriet's legal team before the evening began. On the dinner table beneath a porcelain vase was a microphone embedded into the base. Outside, another camera captured audio and video from behind a wall of climbing flowers on the balcony. Trevor didn't know. He reveled in his story, grew bolder with each glass of wine, each breath of self-pity and self-importance. He said Evelyn had always been too weak, that she never really understood the pressure a man like him had to carry, that if she returned, she would need to be different. No more control, no more questioning. She would have to stay quiet when he needed quiet, disappear when clients came to the house. Evelyn sat perfectly still, her fingers resting lightly on a glass of water, her gaze fixed on him. When Trevor started to circle around the company, hinting that it would be easier if he had full ownership, that her name on the papers only complicated things, Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "It's just a legal formality," he said. "I don't want your name to make the paperwork messy. This is for both of us. If you love me, you'll understand." And then, with the same hollow promise she had heard too many times, he offered her peace. "Just sign a few things and we'll go back to how it was. A happy family. The kids will have both their parents. No one has to know anything ever happened." Evelyn looked at him for a long, still moment. Then she set her glass down. "I'll think about it. Thank you for dinner." She stood up and walked away. No embrace, no glance back. Trevor had no idea, but that night he had given the legal team everything they needed. Coercion, manipulation, admission of intent to alter ownership, confirmation of having thrown her out. Every word was clear, every motive exposed. And this was only the beginning. Evelyn stepped out of the house that had once been a home. Now it was a legal battleground. There was no sorrow on her face, only an uncanny stillness. The war had begun, and this time, she would be the one to write the final sentence. After that brief reconciliation dinner, Trevor had mistaken for a turning point. His confidence swelled larger than ever. Not only did he believe Evelyn would come back, he began drafting his own plan this time, not just to reclaim control of the company, but to regain complete control over Evelyn herself through a far more dangerous route. He laid it all out to Maya one evening as they sat drinking on the rooftop terrace of the Langford mansion, the city lights of Savannah twinkling in the distance. Maya sat beside him, legs crossed, her gaze caught somewhere between curiosity and doubt. "Are you sure about this? Evelyn doesn't seem as easy to handle as she used to be." Trevor laughed, arrogance gleaming in his eyes. "She's weak, alone, with 2 kids. She's got no money, no house, no status. The court will see all of that. Everything's in my hands now. I just need the right script. A few tears, some carefully chosen words for the judge. She won't stand a chance." He leaned forward to pour more wine, his voice dropping low. "I've already contacted a psychologist, someone who'll testify that Evelyn's showing signs of postpartum instability, depression, risk to the children. If it goes to plan, I'll petition for temporary custody. Once I have that, I can negotiate. Either she gives up the trust and company rights or she loses her kids." Maya blinked at him, but then she laughed low and indulgent. "You really know how to pull the strings, don't you?" Trevor raised his glass eyebrows, lifting smugly. "I lived with her long enough to know exactly where the weakest point is. Those kids, they're the only tether she has left. If I control them, she won't dare move against me, and once it's all quieted down, I'll bring you here, officially. Evelyn can just disappear." That conversation, word for word, was captured by the discreet recording device embedded in the rooftop light fixture, a precaution Harriet's legal team had installed in anticipation of Trevor's hubris. They had expected him to boast. They had expected him to reveal the truth when he believed no one was watching. He had done exactly that. When the footage played back in Harriet's office, Evelyn sat in silence. Her hands rested gently around a cup of cold tea, her eyes locked on the screen, watching Trevor and Maya speak of her as if they were discussing business strategies. Not a mother, not her children, but leverage. Harriet switched off the monitor. Her voice was steady, low, and resolute. "This is the most important piece of evidence we've collected. He doesn't just intend to abuse the legal system, he plans to use your children as tools for control. We won't let that happen." Evelyn gave a slight nod. By now there was no space left inside her for tears, not for anger either, only a clarity sharper than steel. If Trevor believed she would tremble, he had forgotten that Evelyn was no longer the woman who wept beneath the rain that night. She was a mother now. She was the rightful heir to the Morgan trust. She was the one holding every truth he had tried to bury. And she would not let her children become bargaining chips in the hands of a man without conscience. Not now. Not ever again. Trevor had no idea that the next evening he opened the door to let Evelyn back into the mansion would be the last time he ever felt like the master of that house. Evelyn arrived precisely on time, but there was no trace of false warmth in her smile, no flicker of hesitation in her eyes. She walked in with calm, measured steps, a thick envelope in one hand and a voice recorder tucked inside her coat pocket. Trevor looked surprised at first, but as always, he quickly composed himself, slipping into that familiar charm laced with condescension. "You're here to talk about the kids, right?" Evelyn didn't answer. She met his eyes with steady clarity, then placed the envelope on the table between them. He picked it up, opened it, brows furrowing as he scanned the contents of transcripts of his conversation with Maya. Recordings from the dinner audio pulled from hidden cameras, every word he had uttered, captured and preserved. "What is this?" he asked, his voice already taut. Evelyn's hands were clenched at her sides, her gaze like ice. "Evidence. Every word you said, every plan you made with Maya, every threat you made to use our children as leverage, all of it, recorded, documented." Trevor took half a step back, his face draining of color. He tried to pivot quickly, anger rising in place of fear. "You recorded me. Is this some kind of blackmail scheme? What do you want, Evelyn?" She didn't flinch. "No blackmail. I just wanted you to know, before we go to court, and to make it clear that from this point on you will no longer control anything." Trevor's fists clenched, his voice wavering as he struggled to hold on to authority, though the panic had already broken through in his eyes. "You think a few recordings are going to take me down? I'm still their legal father. I still have rights." Evelyn nodded slowly. "Yes, you are. And I'm the sole beneficiary of the Morgan Trust. This house, that company, the entire lifestyle you've been parading around in, it all belongs to me." Trevor stood frozen, bloodless, staring at her like the walls had just shifted around him. Evelyn held his gaze for a final moment, then turned and walked toward the door. Her voice cut through the silence behind her, low and even yet sharp as glass. "The court will decide the rest. But I want you to know your game is over. And you were the one who ended it." That morning, the courtroom of the Chatham County Family Court was filled to capacity. Sunlight streamed through tall glass windows, casting warm streaks across the worn tile floor, as if illuminating the moment justice would finally be called by its name. Trevor arrived in a gray suit, jaw-clenched tension running beneath his carefully composed confidence. At his side sat his personal attorney, a young man with a thick folder in his lap and eyes that avoided contact. Across the room, Evelyn sat beside Harriet McAllister. She wore a dark, understated outfit. No jewelry, no makeup, but it was the calm in her gaze that made people turn and look. She was no longer the betrayed wife, no longer the mother who had once clutched 2 infants beneath the cold of a midnight rain. Evelyn now was something else entirely, poised, sharp and resolute. When the judge entered the room, fell instantly silent. The hearing began with Evelyn's attorney laying out the purpose of the trial, the division of assets and determination of custody. The first piece of evidence brought forth was the financial documentation from the Morgan Trust. Harriet rose, her voice steady and unwavering, and addressed the court with deliberate clarity. She presented the entire structure that Daniel Morgan, Evelyn's father, had spent years crafting. Every transfer of capital, every conditional loan from the trust to Langford Consulting, every ownership document tied to the mansion, every clause activated upon betrayal or abuse of the beneficiary. Page by page, number by number, Harriet revealed it all with surgical precision. Trevor's face began to shift, the mask faltering. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering urgently. The lawyer only shook his head, lips pressed shut. Then Harriet requested the court hear the first recording. The room stilled. Trevor's voice echoed through the speakers, lifted from the rooftop conversation with Maya, boasting about using the children as leverage, about hiring a psychologist to claim Evelyn was unstable, about securing custody to pressure her into giving up her rights. There was a stillness that fell across the courtroom like a curtain. Trevor flinched visibly. He leapt to his feet in protest, but the judge firmly called for silence. Harriet remained composed. She played the next video footage from the reconciliation dinner, Trevor persuading Evelyn to sign over control of the company, telling her that women didn't understand business, that she should just leave her name on paper for appearances. When the footage ended, Evelyn sat motionless. Trevor could no longer contain himself. He shouted that the clips were edited, that this was all a plot to destroy him. But Harriet rose once more and calmly submitted third-party forensic reports, certifying the recording's authenticity. Not a single word had been altered. Then the judge turned to Trevor. His voice was measured and deliberate. He said that using one's children as bargaining tools in a custody dispute was unacceptable, that expelling a postpartum wife into the night was indicative of abuse and gross irresponsibility, that attempting to manipulate ownership through deceit was a systematic betrayal of trust. Trevor collapsed back into his seat, his face pale, his posture slumped, all composure drained from his body. and those present in the courtroom could feel it, the quiet, irrevocable collapse of a man who once believed he could control everything. Evelyn didn't smile. There was no triumph in her expression. But in her heart there was something that hadn't existed for a long time. Closure. Quiet, precise, final. Harriet placed a hand gently on Evelyn's shoulder. She said nothing. She didn't need to. This was only the beginning of the legal road ahead. But the hardest part, the part where Evelyn had to face her own fear, her doubt, the darkest parts of her story, was over. Now it was time for the truth to rise and reclaim its place. And Trevor Langford, the man who once thought he could orchestrate everything, now sat hunched and colorless, a faint shadow of the power he believed would never slip from his grasp. 2 weeks after the first court hearing, the final verdict was delivered in a quiet courtroom where the morning light streamed through a thin pane of glass, casting a pale glow across Trevor's expressionless face and Evelyn's calm, unwavering eyes. The judge read each line of the ruling with a voice that was even and deliberate, but carried the weight of every truth laid bare in the weeks prior. The court declared Evelyn Morgan the sole legal guardian with full custody of the 2 children, citing Trevor Langford's history of manipulative behavior and the clear signs of potential harm and neglect. The court also confirmed the rightful ownership of all contested assets as belonging to the Morgan Trust, including full equity in Langford. Consulting the Langford estate and all related investments with Evelyn named as the sole beneficiary. Trevor was barred from contacting or visiting the children without court-supervised visitation and would require a certified psychological evaluation confirming behavioral improvement sustained for at least 6 months before any changes could be considered. He said nothing. He sat motionless, hands clenched, lips pressed thin, his eyes hollowed out by the slow, irreversible realization that nothing he once controlled was his anymore. Evelyn gave a single quiet nod when the judge finished. There were no tears, no applause, only the solemn stillness of justice restored after a long, relentless descent through darkness. Outside the courtroom, news traveled fast. A local newspaper broke the story first, and then national outlets began picking it up. The story of the wife forced out of her home with 2 newborns in the middle of a storm, the woman who seemed to lose everything, but returned armed with truth, legal precision, and unshakable resolve, captivated the public. Headlines flooded every feed. Betrayed wife wins landmark case. Manipulator exposed. Evelyn Morgan's fight becomes symbol for thousands of silenced women. Clips from the courtroom circulated online, especially one moment when Evelyn stood and spoke with a voice as steady as steel. "I didn't ask for revenge. I asked for the truth." A women's advocacy group in New York reposted the quote with the caption, "This is why we do not stay silent." Messages began pouring in: emails, letters, handwritten notes. Harriet's office became flooded with calls of support. Organizations reached out hoping to partner with Evelyn to raise awareness. A documentary production company proposed turning her story into a streaming series. Evelyn declined most offers. She had no interest in turning her pain into public entertainment. But she agreed to one exclusive interview for a women's magazine, not to recount her suffering, but to speak about the importance of financial preparedness, legal knowledge, and the unshakable belief in one's worth. When the piece was published, it reached millions of readers. At the end of it, Evelyn wrote just one line: "If you think you can't rise, look at me. I once believed the same. And I was wrong." Trevor disappeared from the media entirely. No more boasting posts, no more party photos. Maya erased every shared picture from her accounts, unfollowed Trevor without comment. Langford Consulting rebranded. The website launched a new homepage. New executive chair Evelyn Morgan. In her office, Evelyn stood before the tall windows overlooking the city. She still bore the scar from the emergency delivery. She still had nights without sleep, rocking 2 infants in her arms. But she no longer lowered her head. She had won not just in court, but in the fight to reclaim herself. And that to Evelyn would always be the greatest victory of all. 3 months after the final court ruling, when everything seemed to be settling and Evelyn had begun to rebuild a steady life with her 2 children, Trevor unexpectedly filed a petition to revisit the custody arrangement. The request was formally submitted to the Chatham County Family Court, accompanied by a nearly 20-page affidavit detailing his so-called journey of awakening his remorse and his desire to be a true father. In the document, Trevor laid out a narrative of personal growth over the past 3 months. Weekly therapy sessions, enrollment in a parenting course, and special emphasis on the few court-supervised visits he had been granted in which he had appeared attentive and gentle toward the children. He included letters of support from a local pastor, a personal fitness coach, and a private mental health counselor, all vouching that Trevor had changed, was now living a healthy, responsible life and was ready to embrace fatherhood. On social media, he returned with a carefully rebranded image. Gone were the lavish parties and ego-driven displays of wealth. In their place, he posted about forgiveness, healing, and starting over. There were photos of him reading books in the park, annotated pages from child development classes, even a short video where he held his niece in his arms captioned, "I've lost many things, but the one thing I've never given up is the right to be a father." The public response was mixed. Some expressed sympathy, suggesting everyone deserves a second chance. Others, remembering the leaked recordings and documented manipulation, remained skeptical of his reinvention. But what raised immediate concern was the fine print in Trevor's petition concern that Harriet spotted the moment she received the full document. Alongside the request to revisit custody, Trevor had asked the court to re-examine certain financial clauses related to the Morgan Trust. Specifically, he invoked a provision buried deep within the Morgan family's inheritance framework, a clause allowing access to trust resources for those legally recognized as primary caretakers of minor beneficiaries. If Trevor regained even partial custodial rights, he could argue for financial access, claiming support for the children's welfare, but in effect, giving himself a foothold in the trust that had been walled off from him by design. Evelyn read the entire filing without surprise. She wasn't angry, she wasn't shocked, she was simply tired. For 3 months, she had worked without pause, raising 2 infants, running a company, reconstructing her life from the ground up. She had once hoped that Trevor might truly change one day, but not like this, not behind a freshly polished mask. She sat across from Harriet in the law office, setting the thick file down on the table with quiet finality. Then she exhaled slowly. "He still thinks he's smarter than everyone else." Harriet nodded, eyes still scanning the pages. "But he doesn't know we've been ready for this. The recordings, the testimonies, the evidence he hasn't seen yet." Evelyn clenched her hands in her lap. She didn't want to keep fighting. But she knew she would, one more time, not just to protect her children, but to extinguish completely and irrevocably the shadow Trevor still clung to, one he still hoped to cast over her life. And this time she would see it through to the very end, leaving no door open behind her. When Trevor's petition to revisit the custody arrangement was officially submitted to the court, Harriet didn't hesitate for a second. She and her legal team immediately reopened the full case file, combing through every archived document, every overlooked recording, every thread that could strengthen the argument that Trevor hadn't changed, he had only changed his mask. In a quiet conference room, Harriet replayed a piece of audio that had been excluded from the original trial. In it, Trevor's voice filtered through the speakers, half joking but edged with unmistakable intent as he spoke to Maya. "If I get custody of the kids, I can petition to revisit the protection clause in the Morgan Trust." Not even Evelyn's lawyer caught that. A big enough custody cost, and I'm back in the game. Maya had laughed then, but Trevor continued, his voice dipping low. "Everyone thinks I'm the villain, but the court just needs to see a father who looks sorry. You cry at the right time, say the right things, add a few official-looking documents." That recording was submitted to the judge alongside a sworn statement from a former Langford consulting employee, someone who had been present during internal discussions and confidential meetings. She had worked in the finance department, and after the first trial she had quietly resigned, stating she could no longer trust the ethics of the leadership. After weeks of deliberation, she contacted Harriet and offered up everything she had: emails, internal memos, chat logs, and notes from private meetings in which Trevor had discussed strategies to gain financial access through custody manipulation. He had even talked about hiring someone to fabricate psychological evaluations just in case. In Harriet's official response to the court, she laid out the new evidence with airtight logic and clarity. She dissected Trevor's words from the recording, aligned them with the phrasing in his custody petition, and highlighted the convenient overlap between custodial rights and asset access. This was not the work of a father seeking connection with his children, she argued. It was the maneuvering of a manipulator using his own children as bargaining chips. Simultaneously, Evelyn was summoned for a follow-up hearing, and this time she did not come alone. At her side was a licensed independent psychologist who had monitored her postpartum recovery over the past 6 months. The expert presented a detailed report stating that Evelyn not only demonstrated full maternal competency, but had also created a stable, emotionally healthy, and financially secure environment for the children. Meanwhile, Trevor could not provide a single piece of evidence showing hands-on care, daily involvement, or long-term responsibility. His curated videos and staged social media posts crumbled under scrutiny, Courts, after all, don't rule on optics, they rule on actions. Faced with damning audio, a credible insider witness, and Evelyn's irrefutable stability, Trevor faltered. His confident exterior eroded as he sat silent, avoiding every gaze in the courtroom, his hands clasped tightly together. And in that moment, the man who once fancied himself a master of manipulation understood everything had slipped beyond his reach. No amount of performative sorrow would save him now. No script could rewrite the truth that had finally surfaced. Harriet closed the file, adjusted her glasses, and spoke in a voice that was soft but unyielding. "It's clear. This is not the plea of a father. This is the final tactic of a man who has lost everything and is clinging to the last possible thread with calculated desperation." And Evelyn, the woman who was once cast aside, like refuse, stood now at the center of the courtroom, no longer defined by what was taken from her, but by what she had claimed back, one truth at a time. The second ruling did not draw the noisy attention of the first trial. There were no crowds waiting outside, no flashing cameras or breaking headlines. But for Evelyn, this moment, quiet, still, and final, was the true closing of every door Trevor had ever tried to pry open. Inside the courtroom, only the directly involved parties were present, each one cloaked in their own private silence. The judge read the decision slowly, his voice steady and unshaken, slicing cleanly through the room's hush. The court fully denied Trevor Langford's petition to revise the custody agreement, citing overwhelming evidence that the defendant had demonstrated no substantive change in behavior. More critically, the court noted that the intent behind the motion appeared to prioritize financial motives rather than the well-being of the children. The judge continued, stating plainly that any attempt to exploit legal systems in order to manipulate custodial rights was not just a misuse of the law, but a direct insult to the principles of justice itself, something no civilized society could or would tolerate. Trevor said nothing. He sat hunched, head bowed, fingers locked together beneath the table. In that moment, he was no longer the smug husband who once stood framed in a doorway casting his wife and newborns into the night. No longer the camera-ready father with a practiced smile. He was only what remained, an exposed man, hollowed by arrogance and undone by the very greed that had once fueled his rise. Across the room, Evelyn gently squeezed Harriet's hand when the ruling was announced. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She didn't even nod. She simply remained still. It was the stillness of peace, like the first breeze of summer slipping in after a season of unrelenting storms. Harriet turned to her, her voice quiet, meant only for Evelyn. "It's time now. Live the life you were meant to have, and this time no one can take it from you." After the hearing, there were no press conferences, no waiting crowd. But the story still found its way into the world. A few small publications recounted it, their headlines simple yet unshakably firm. She won, again, steady as before. Evelyn returned home in the soft glow of a late afternoon. Her 2 children were fast asleep in their room, the last golden light of day streaming through the curtains, stretching across the hardwood floor like warm silk. She walked quietly, sat beside the crib, watched the gentle rise and fall of their breath. No one could know how long her journey had been, how many times she thought she wouldn't make it. But in that quiet moment, Evelyn understood something with absolute clarity. A new chapter had begun. One without Trevor, without courtrooms, without battles she had to win just to survive. There was only her and her children, and a future she would now write with her own hands. This time, the pen belonged to her, Evelyn Morgan, the woman who had once been discarded, now the woman who stood unshaken, and who never, not once, stepped back. On an early autumn morning in Savannah, just as the sky cleared after a long night of rain, Evelyn Morgan stepped onto a small stage nestled in the courtyard of a newly painted cream-colored building on the city's west side. Behind her stood a large sign bearing the engraved words, "Morgan Foundation." In front of her sat dozens of women in stillness, each carrying her own story, her own pain, their eyes fixed on a woman who once stood exactly where they had. Evelyn brought no prepared notes. She stood tall, fingers wrapped around the microphone, her voice slow and steady as it began to rise. "Less than a year ago, I walked through the rain at night carrying my 2 newborns. I had no home, no money, no family. I didn't think I would survive, but I got back up, and today I'm here not to tell you about the past, but to begin a new journey." She paused, her gaze moving gently across the crowd. Morgan Foundation is not a typical charity. It is a place for women who are financially manipulated, controlled by the very people they once trusted and loved. A place where a wife who never had access to her own bank account can learn how to manage her money. A place where a single mother once threatened with the law can find a lawyer who will truly stand with her. A place where women are not judged for having failed, but are given the chance to begin again. For 3 months following the final court hearing, Evelyn had worked quietly alongside Harriet and a team of financial advisors, lawyers, and therapists to build the foundation's groundwork. The seed funding came from her personal earnings within the Morgan Trust. In its early days, the foundation accepted no outside donations to preserve its independence. She established 3 core pillars: financial education for women, legal aid for victims of abuse in marriages or romantic relationships, and 6 months of free psychological counseling for anyone who has endured mental control or financial violence. Each request for assistance would be reviewed carefully. This was never just about handing out money. It was about building a path to full recovery. Evelyn never wanted to give away money. She wanted to return autonomy. The launch of the Morgan Foundation ended with a quiet round of applause. No fanfare, no spectacle. Yet, in the eyes of each woman who stood afterward and stepped into the building with renewed hope, there was something deeper than words. A young woman approached Evelyn, gently took her hand, and said with a trembling voice, "I read your story in the paper. I thought it only happened in movies. But it turns out I was once like you. And today, I think maybe one day I'll tell my story too." Evelyn smiled, her hand tightening around the young woman's. She never needed to be called an inspiration. She never needed to stand on a grand stage. She only wanted to create a place where if any woman ever had to walk away from her home in the middle of a rainy night, she would know she was not alone. That is how the Morgan Foundation was born. Not from triumph, but from survival. Not to seek revenge, but to give voice, and above all, to protect other women in the same way her late father once protected her. On an early winter afternoon, as the pale light of day quietly filtered through the glass window of the small office at the Morgan Foundation, Evelyn once again stepped into her father's old archive room. It was a space where Mrs. Grace, the longtime caretaker of the Morgan family, had carefully preserved every record file, audio tape, and handwritten letter Daniel Morgan had ever left behind. Evelyn had not come searching for anything in particular, yet something within her stirred with a quiet urgency. Perhaps it was because, after all she had been through, she knew the time had come to look back one final time, to gently close the door on the past and open another towards something far greater. On a low wooden shelf pressed against the wall, she found a small wooden box, its surface covered with a fine layer of dust. Inside was a letter sealed carefully in red wax, addressed to her in the unmistakable handwriting she knew by heart. Evelyn sat down slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she broke the seal. She unfolded the letter. The first line stole her breath. "If you're reading this letter, then I'm likely no longer here, but that also means you've survived the very thing I always feared most. I'm sorry I couldn't be there when you were hurting the most, but I never truly left. I've always believed that one day you would come to understand the difference between real love and control disguised as love." Evelyn read on in silence. The letter was no more than 2 pages long, but each line seemed to wrap itself around her heart. Daniel wrote that even while he was alive, he had seen in Trevor the early signs of a man who sought control, who used finances to make others dependent on him, and he knew he could never stop Evelyn while she was still blinded by love. So instead of forbidding her, he quietly prepared everything. The provisions within the Morgan Trust, the protective structures around the estate, the lawyers he had once trusted were all put in place and left waiting, ready to be unlocked only when Evelyn had endured the painful journey she needed in order to truly grow. At the end of the letter, he wrote that there are lessons in life no one else can teach you except the ones you must live through yourself. And if you're reading these words, it means you've learned that true strength doesn't come from revenge, but from the power to rise and keep moving forward. Evelyn folded the letter, her tears falling silently onto her hands. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a deep, unshakable peace. She understood now that everything she had endured, however cruel or unforgiving, had shaped her into the woman she had become. A woman who rose not only for herself, but for the hundreds and thousands of women still trapped in the quiet despair of broken marriages, manipulated by emotion or money. And the Morgan Foundation would be the legacy of that journey, of Evelyn, and of the father she would forever be grateful for. Evelyn's story was not simply one of reclaiming power after a bruising divorce, but a testament to the quiet preparation and unconditional love from a previous generation that can become the lifeline we reach for in our darkest moments. If you are someone who feels trapped in a relationship where respect is absent, if you are being controlled by a wallet, by sweet words laced with subtle threats, or by the calculated weight of silence, know this: you are not alone. You have the right to choose, you have the strength to rise, and you have the power to find your way back to yourself. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever seen or lived through something similar in your own life or in the lives of those around you? We truly hope to hear your thoughts, your reflections, and your stories from the heart in the comments below. Let's create a kind and compassionate space where every voice is heard and healing can begin. And if this story has touched you in any way, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this video to help spread its message further. Emotional Echoes brings you real stories rich in emotion and humanity every single day. Thank you for staying with us through to the end of this video. We wish you strength, peace, joy, and a life full of love each and every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you in the next story.